He thought he had found his refuge at last. The farmer had worked soil all his life, bent his back under sun and rain, yet never truly had a place to call his own. He had laboured on other men's land, waking before dawn to harness mules, hauling stone from stubborn fields, planting and reaping with nothing to show but calluses and weary bones. He had always dreamed that one day he might have land of his own, not just to work, but to belong to. A place where his sweat would sink into soil that answered back with more than coin in another man's pocket. When the chance finally came, he seized it with both hands. The house was old, built of timber, blackened by time, and a stone foundation that seemed to grip the earth like roots. 16 hectares came with it, a stretch of meadow sloping down toward a forest, and beyond that, a lake that lay quiet beneath the trees. The price had been low enough to stir suspicion, but the farmer was not a man of questions. He took it as a blessing, a stroke of luck at last turning in his favour, and signed his name with hands roughened from years of toil. When he walked the property for the first time, he breathed the sharp air as though it might cleanse every weary hour that had come before. Life here was different from the crowded village where he had spent his boyhood. The nights were truly silent, broken only by the cry of owls or the shuffle of deer in the undergrowth. The mornings came with a fog that curled off the meadow and drifted across the lake, silver in the first light. The house creaked and groaned like an old animal settling its bones, but the farmer found comfort in those sounds. He unpacked the few belongings he had, some tools, a wooden chest, his father's old knife, and laid them out carefully, as if the act itself might bind him to the place. In the village of Greyford, a cluster of stone cottages huddled against the wind, and a single crooked steeple leaning as though tired of holding its bell, he was met with polite nods. The road into town was little more than packed dirt, and it carried him past gardens fenced with rough-hewn rails, past laundry lines strung with shirts faded from sun and rain, past children who stopped their play to watch him with wide, solemn eyes before darting back behind doorframes. Greyford was small, quiet, its rhythm set by the toll of the church bell and the scrape of boots on cobblestones. It was not unfriendly, but it was not open either. It was a place that measured strangers before deciding whether to let them stay. At the store, a low building smelling of flour, salt pork, and lamp oil, the men standing by the counter turned to look when he entered. They did not stare rudely, but with the steady weight of curiosity, as if placing him in some unspoken order of things. Not unkind, no, yet cautious, as though his presence had disrupted a pattern that had gone unbroken for too long. Their eyes traced his weathered hands, the lines etched deep into his face, the quiet way he carried himself. The farmer felt the scrutiny, but did not flinch from it. He nodded back, lifted his hat, and asked for what he needed in a voice even and plain. The questions came as he expected. Where was he from? Had he worked the land before? Was he here alone? He answered each one without hesitation, offering nothing more than truth. Yes, he had farmed since boyhood. Yes, he came to find a place of his own. And yes, he had purchased the old property by the lake. The words left his mouth easily, but he noticed the way they settled into the room, like stones dropped into still water. A ripple moved through the men, a silence that pressed against the shelves, the floorboards, even the dust caught in the light from the high windows. The storekeeper busied himself with measuring grain, but his hands slowed. Another man cleared his throat, but said nothing. It was only then that he sensed it. The pause too long to be casual, the glance exchanged between neighbours who had heard more than they wished to. He thought of asking, but something in the air stilled his tongue. Instead, he accepted the quiet with the same calm he carried into storms, though a faint unease began to root in him. Only when an old man, his shoulders bent and his hands scarred by years of labour, spoke from his chair near the stove did the tension break. His voice was low, almost careless, yet it threaded the silence with weight. "That lake of yours," the man said, eyes fixed not on the farmer, but on the floorboards at his feet. "It's got stories. Best not to go poking." The words seemed thrown like idle talk. A scrap of gossip carried no farther than the length of the room. But when the old man finally lifted his gaze, the farmer saw it, a sharpness honed by years, a heaviness that came not from rumour but remembrance. The look was steady, deliberate, heavy with warning. He brushed it aside at first. Men in villages spoke of stories often, spinning superstition into the cracks of hard life. He thought it nothing more. But that night, standing on his porch with the meadow spread before him and the dark line of trees concealing the lake, the words returned to him. The air was cool, the stars veiled in drifting cloud, and he felt a heaviness in his chest he could not name. Curiosity gnawed at him until the next morning, restless and sharp, a hunger that no sleep could dull. The night had been long and broken, each dream threaded with dripping water and the silent press of unseen eyes. When dawn finally seeped across the horizon, he rose as if pulled by a tether. Without breakfast, without thought of his fields or tools, he walked through the forest path that wound down to the lake. The pines crowded close around him, their trunks black with shadow, and the undergrowth whispered against his boots. Even the birdsong seemed muted, distant, as if the woods themselves deferred to what waited below. At last, the trees thinned, and he stood again at the water's edge. The lake stretched smooth and still, unbroken as a pane of black glass, reflecting the pale morning sky in its surface. The faintest breath of wind touched the treetops but left the water undisturbed, as though it belonged to no weather of this world. Its silence was thick, heavier than the hush of the woods, pressing against his ears until even his own breathing seemed too loud. He realized then it was not merely absence of sound, it was something active, a silence that swallowed what tried to exist within it. He crouched by the bank, lantern set aside, and let his hands skim across the water's surface. The shock of it made him flinch. It was colder than he expected, colder than the forest air, as though the lake drew its chill from an endless depth below. The touch lingered on his fingers long after he had pulled them back, numbing his skin as if the water carried something it wished to leave behind. He wiped his hand on his trousers, but the cold clung like frost. He walked slowly along the bank, the mud sucking at his boots, reeds whispering at his ankles. Now and then a ripple spread across the surface, though nothing had touched it. He kept moving, driven by the gnawing pull in his chest, until he came upon something that made him stop. Ahead, half hidden by creeping ivy and moss, a circle of stones jutted from the earth. They were not scattered as boulders fall by chance, but placed, arranged with a precision that the years had only partly obscured. Their edges had softened under rain and time, their tops blanketed thick with moss, but their pattern was deliberate, undeniable. He froze, breath caught in his throat, for the sight of such order, in a place so wild, struck him with a quiet dread. He knelt closer, brushing away clumps of dirt and tangled roots with trembling fingers. The stones were fitted together with care, their lines running true despite the sag of centuries. When his hand moved across one narrow gap, he felt it, the faintest draught of air seeping upward through a crack between them. He held his palm there, steady, and yes, it was unmistakable. Cool, damp, carrying with it the scent of stone long hidden from sun and rain. Yet beneath that was another trace, subtler but stronger once noticed. It was the smell of depth, of something older than the forest above, a breath that had waited in silence to be found. He leaned back, scanning the circle as a whole. The soil around the stones had sunk inward, forming a shallow depression that cupped their outline. It was not erosion alone, it looked as if the very earth had sagged and drawn down, as though the ground itself resisted what lay below. The forest floor, thick with roots and fallen needles, had tried to heal over the scar, to erase it. Yet still the stones remained, patient, deliberate, marking their place. The thought slid coldly into his mind. It was almost as though the earth had tried to swallow what lay beneath. The farmer frowned. Perhaps it had been a well once, or the mouth of a root cellar long forgotten. Yet the stones looked like a seal, not an opening. Why would anyone go to such trouble to hide it? He stood again and looked out over the lake. Its surface betrayed nothing, but the stillness pressed on him until his skin prickled. He turned back toward the house, forcing himself to laugh at his own unease. But that night, the image of the stones would not leave him. He dreamt of air whispering from the cracks, thin threads of breath rising from the earth, as though the ground itself were alive. He dreamt of water dripping in black halls, each drop stretched and magnified until it was the only sound left in the world. He dreamt of footsteps echoing in places where no men walked, the cadence steady, purposeful, closing in though no shape ever appeared. He woke with sweat beading his brow though the night was cold, the blanket tight around his shoulders. His heart pounded as though he had been running. For a long while he lay still, staring into the rafters, listening for the silence between each beat. Sleep would not return. The next morning he rose before dawn, unable to keep still. The farmhouse walls seemed smaller now, their timber beams whispering with every gust outside, reminding him of the drip and the footsteps. Restlessness drove him to gather what he thought he would need. A lamp, trimmed and filled with oil, its glass chimed as he carried it, and the crowbar he used for prying stones from stubborn fields. He weighed it in his hand as he walked, knowing it was no weapon but comfort all the same. His boots found the forest path almost by memory now, though each step sank deeper into the damp earth, as if the ground wanted to pull him back. When he reached the circle of stones, the trees leaned overhead, their branches knitted together in a canopy that dimmed even the early light. The air was cool, almost still, and when he knelt, the draught touched his face again. It was colder this time, sharper, as though it remembered him. He leaned close, breathing the damp that rose through the cracks. The scent carried with it more than wet stone. It carried iron, metallic and bitter, a taste like old blood left in the air too long. He set his jaw, bracing himself, and wedged the crowbar against the largest stone. The moss clung stubbornly, tearing loose in wet clumps as he heaved. The stone groaned against the soil, an awful sound that seemed to echo deeper than the surface, as though something below stirred in answer. Sweat prickled his neck despite the chill, and still he pressed until the rock shifted, scraping aside to reveal a darkness beneath. Cold air rushed up, damp and metallic, and with it came the weight of years unseen, as if every trapped season exhaled at once. One stone moved was not enough. He set the crowbar again, muscles straining, and pried another free. Then another. Each stone gave way with the same reluctant cry, earth slumping into the gap as though resisting the intrusion. At last a hollow yawned wide enough to peer into. He leaned forward, lamp extended, the glow spilling downward to reveal what lay beyond. His breath caught in his throat. Carved steps emerged from the soil, their edges worn smooth and slick with moisture, vanishing into shadow below. They looked impossibly old, each riser cut with care, each tread glistening as though polished by countless feet, or by the steady passage of water. His mind reeled at the thought that others had walked here before, men who had left no record but these stones and the silence that guarded them. The sensible part of his mind urged him to stop, to replace the stones one by one, to walk away and never return. He felt it like a hand pressed to his shoulder, insistent and almost pleading. But his fingers would not release the lamp. Instead, his grip tightened until his knuckles ached, and his other hand clenched the crowbar, as though it could anchor him against fear. He set his boot on the first step. The stone was slick, nearly sending him backward, but he steadied himself. Then another step, and another. The world above retreated quickly, the morning air thinning to a memory as the damp closed around him. His shoulders brushed stone on either side, the passage narrowing, the walls pressing close. He looked upward once more, and the daylight had shrunk to nothing more than a pale ring above him, a reminder of a world already too far away. He lowered himself further, until the daylight above was only a pale ring, and the walls pressed close around him. The passage was narrow, the air thick and cool. Water dripped steadily from somewhere above, echoing against the stone. He traced the walls with his free hand. They were rough, but here and there he felt the unmistakable marks of tools. Men had worked here once. At the bottom of the steps, the passage leveled into a corridor. His footsteps rang too loud in the silence. He moved forward, the lamp throwing long shadows across the damp stone. Fragments littered the ground. Rusted nails, splintered wood, a length of chain eaten through with corrosion. He crouched and touched one piece, and it crumbled beneath his fingers. He pressed on until the corridor widened, stone walls parting into a vault that seemed to breathe its own damp air. His lantern swung forward, and the light touched blackness that swallowed it whole. Then, step by step, the truth of the place revealed itself. An underground lake stretched before him, vast and silent, its surface so dark, and still it looked less like water and more like a mirror laid flat against the earth. Each ripple was born only from the drip of water falling from the ceiling, slow, steady, like the tick of a clock buried beneath centuries. The sound carried across the chamber, magnified by the hollow stone, until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The air here was different, colder, thicker, laced with the sharp tang of minerals and the sour breath of decay. It pressed against his chest, making every breath a labor, as if the cave itself resisted intruders. He stepped closer, the soles of his boots sinking into a carpet of mud that pulled at him with reluctant strength. Along the edge, half buried in that muck, lay the remains of beams, timber blackened with age and slick with moisture. They jutted out like the bones of some long-dead leviathan, arranged in the memory of a structure that had once stretched into the water. A pier, perhaps, a platform, a path into depths no man should walk, and scattered among the ruins he saw crates, dozens, maybe more, warped with rot, their shapes half consumed by algae and mud. Some were crushed by the weight of stonefall, others burst open at the corners. Even in their ruin, they held a strange defiance, as if refusing to vanish entirely. The lantern's glow caught at their edges, and where slime had peeled back, metal winked faintly, small and sharp, like the eye of something watching him. The farmer's heart thudded so loudly he felt it in his throat, each beat heavy, echoing in his ears like a drum muffled by stone. The silence of the cavern seemed to magnify it, as though the lake itself had paused to listen. He crouched near the shore, the mud sucking greedily at his boots with every shift of his weight, pulling as if it wanted to hold him there. His lantern trembled in his grip, the flame quivering and stretching shadows across the beams that jutted from the black water. His breath misted in the cold air, dissolving before him in pale ribbons that vanished almost instantly, as though even the air rejected permanence here. He leaned closer, shoulders hunched against the chill, squinting toward one crate in particular. Its broken planks sagged inward, swollen and blackened from centuries of damp. Algae clung to its edges in long, stringy veils, shifting slightly in the unseen draft that circled the cavern. Within the fragile gap between the splintered boards, the lantern's glow caught on something faint yet undeniable, a sharp, unnatural gleam. The sight froze him where he knelt. Not a coin exactly, not the familiar edge of a tool dulled by rust. This light was different. It was deliberate, too bright for the rot that surrounded it, a glimmer that should not have survived this long, yet endured. The cavern pressed in with silence. Every drip from the ceiling sounded like a stone striking water. The smell of the place thickened in his nose. Damp earth, mineral tang, and beneath it a faint metallic scent that made the back of his throat tighten. He felt suddenly as though he were not alone, though the chamber was vast and empty, but for the water and the ruins. Without realizing it, he stretched out a hand. His fingers hovered in the space above the crate, brushing through the damp air, reaching toward the broken wood. The cold seemed to grow sharper the closer he came, not the chill of simple water, but something deeper, older, like the breath of a tomb. The air itself felt charged, clinging to his skin, prickling with the weight of all that had been buried and left untouched. He held his breath as his hand hovered nearer. The flame of the lantern guttered once, as if recoiling from what he was about to do. A single drop of water fell from the cavern ceiling and struck the surface of the lake, sending ripples outward, shattering the stillness in expanding rings that reached the beams, the crates, the stones. He froze, hands suspended. In that moment, something primal awoke within him, louder than thought, stronger than curiosity. A current of instinct surged through him, sharp and sudden, like a blade pressed to the side of his neck. His chest tightened. His mouth went dry. The pressure of the silence seemed to close around his skull. Slowly, painfully, he pulled his hand back, the fingers curling into a fist against his thigh. His heart hammered harder, faster, so loud it seemed impossible that nothing else stirred in answer. He knew with absolute certainty, more than sight, more than reason, that to touch that glint, to lift the plank and see what lay within, would be to step across a threshold he could never return from. Some part of him whispered that to touch it would be to cross a line he could never return from. He looked at the water again. It lay black and endless, deeper than it appeared, a surface so still it seemed to wait. He could not shake the sense that if he leaned too far, if he disturbed that delicate balance, something would rise to meet him. Shapes suggested themselves in the shifting dark, long shadows, hollow eyes, ripples that did not belong to the drops above. Still, the sight of it all filled him with something tangled and dangerous, awe braided with unease, curiosity shadowed by dread. This place was a secret, sealed away not by accident but by will. The crates, the beams, the endless water, they were not meant for any living eyes. As the drip of water echoed through the chamber, steady and unyielding, he knew with a certainty that weighed on his bones. Whoever had built this place had not meant it to be found. He returned to the surface shaken, but the vision of the chamber clung to him. That night he dreamt of men bent beneath lantern light, carrying crates along planks, their boots striking in rhythm, and then sudden silence. He woke with the sound of dripping still in his ears. By morning, his resolve had hardened. He packed rope, gloves, a flask, and descended again. This time, he pried loose one of the crates with the rope and dragged it onto the shore. The wood groaned and split, spilling rusted tools, scraps of fabric, and beneath them, a slip of paper miraculously preserved. The ink was faded, the words broken by water stains, but one phrase stood clear: "Leave before." The farmer stared at it until his throat tightened. Leave before what? Collapse? Flood? Something worse? He slipped the paper into his pocket and returned to the surface, but the words followed him like a curse. The next day in Greyford, he asked again at the store. The men grew silent. One old man with eyes like flint finally said, "There were mines in these hills long ago. Gold, silver, maybe copper. Men came and worked, but they left and they didn't come back. That's all you need to know." The farmer pressed him, but the man only shook his head. "The earth keeps what it wants. Don't dig where it don't belong." But he could not stop himself. The chamber pulled at him like a tide, its silence more magnetic than any call of comfort above ground. The first time he told himself it was only curiosity, that he wanted to make sense of what he had found. The second time he insisted it was only to prove he could, that he was not afraid. But after that, excuses dissolved. He returned because he could not do otherwise. At night, the drip of water echoed in his dreams, forming into patterns that sounded almost like words he could not quite understand. In the morning, he woke with dampness on his skin, though the roof above him was dry. Each day, the words "leave before" burned hotter in his pocket, the paper's edges curling, as if the warning itself resisted being carried. He thought once of throwing it into the fire, but his hand would not let it go. Instead, he kept it close, a talisman of dread that bound him tighter to the place it told him to abandon. So he went back, again and again, deeper each time. The air met him like a living thing, cool and heavy, filling his lungs with the taste of stone and iron. He pried open crates that had swollen with years of damp. Within he found scraps of cloth too tattered to name, buttons scattered like teeth, tools corroded almost to dust. Once he uncovered the rusted head of a pickaxe, its handle long dissolved, but the iron scarred with wear, proof of hands that had gripped it until the end. Another time he found a ledger, its cover warped, but its pages still bearing faint ink. Names filled them in narrow script, and though many were too smudged to read, enough remained clear to turn his blood cold. They were men from the village, their surnames still spoken by the shopkeeper with the crooked smile, the mason who whistled as he worked, the farmer with the stooped back who always nodded in greeting. The realization crept over him like frost. This was why they kept silent. Their ancestors had been here. The hush around the lake was not ignorance, but inheritance. Deeper still he ventured, lantern trembling in his hand, as he forced himself through a narrower passage half collapsed. The stone pressed close, and more than once he had to twist sideways to fit. Dust sifted down at his shoulders, trickling into his collar like cold fingers. The smell thickened, rot, iron, and beneath it a lingering sharpness he recognized too well. Barrels lay split open, their staves rotted into ribs of wood, but even now the faint scent of powder clung to the air. He imagined men stacking them in haste, their shadows long against the wall, sweat streaking their faces as they worked, fleeing before they could ignite or collapse. Perhaps they meant to seal something in. Perhaps they meant to destroy it, but failed. The possibility that they had never truly left haunted him. Scratches scarred the walls, more than he could count. Some were deep gouges as if made by tools, but others were thin, frantic, cut by fingernails or knives dulled to uselessness. Among them ran tally marks in uneven rows, the inkless diary of men measuring time where no sun could follow. He traced them with his fingertips, feeling how they grew ragged toward the end, strokes trembling, hurried. In one cavity bricked shut, he pried the stones away with the knife, each rock scraping free with reluctant weight. Dust clouded his face and stung his eyes, but he pressed on until the opening yawned. Inside, the wall was crowded with dozens more tally marks etched in cramped lines, pressed so close together it seemed they fought for space, and beneath them words jagged and desperate. "We cannot leave." The farmer staggered back, bile rising in his throat. The bed frame, the scraps of clothing, the tally marks. Men had lived and died down here, trapped in darkness. Whatever had driven them into the chamber had kept them from returning. After that discovery, the house no longer felt like refuge. What had once seemed a sturdy shelter of timber and stone now pressed in on him like a coffin. At night he heard dripping within the very walls, steady as a clock, but not any clock he had ever known. Each drop felt too heavy, too deliberate, as if it were marking something older and more patient than time. He lay awake in the dark, staring at the rafters, hearing the rhythm echo through the boards beneath his bed. Sometimes he thought it came from the cellar. Other times it seemed to seep from the roof. More than once he pressed his ear against the wall and swore the sound was inside the wood itself, as if the beams had absorbed water from the black pool below and now bled it drop by drop, eternally. He told himself it was only his mind playing tricks, but no argument could still the tightening in his chest whenever the silence fell between drips. That silence was worse than the sound. It was as if something paused to listen back. He packed his belongings at last, unable to endure another night within those walls. His father's knife went first, the old blade wrapped in oilcloth, and slid into his bag with hands that shook more than he wanted to admit. Then a few clothes, worn and unremarkable, folded carelessly, as if even fabric might soak up whatever clung to the air of that place. Last were the scraps of paper with their warnings, the jagged scrawls he had found near the stone chamber, words that seemed written in haste, in terror, yet with a conviction no weathering could erase. He could not decipher all of them, but the fragments he did understand were enough to bind themselves into his memory. Do not descend alone. The water remembers. Silence is not safety. He did not know why he kept them. Perhaps he believed he owed those lost voices at least the dignity of remembrance. Perhaps he already knew he would never be free of them. As he left, he looked once more toward the lake. Its surface was calm, silver in the morning light, reflecting the pale stretch of sky like a mirror too perfect to be trusted. The pines surrounding it bent in a stillness that felt staged, as if the whole forest held its breath. He wanted to believe it was only a lake, a piece of water like any other, but in his bones he knew its stillness was no peace. It was silence, deliberate and heavy, guarding secrets meant to be buried. Every ripple he did not see seemed louder than waves. Every shimmer of light on its surface felt like a lid pressed down upon something restless beneath. He stood at the edge of the road longer than he meant to, as though waiting for the lake to acknowledge him one last time. When the wind rose, it did not touch the water. When the morning sun brightened, it did not warm the air. He felt the same dread he had felt when he first pushed open that hidden door, an understanding that the world was deeper than men allowed themselves to know, and that some places existed not to be lived in, but to be feared. Only when a crow broke the silence with a single harsh cry did he finally turn away. He drove with his jaw tight, every bend in the road taking him farther from the house, yet not from what had been uncovered. The tires hummed against the asphalt, but in the spaces between he swore he still heard the dripping, faint but unmistakable, as though it had followed him out and nested in the hollow of his skull. He tried rolling down the window, blasting the radio, even speaking aloud to himself, but the rhythm pressed on regardless, patient and steady. The tally marks carved into the hidden stone, the strange words gouged into walls, the silence of the underground lake. They belonged to him now, as much as to the men who had vanished into its depths. They had passed their burden on, and he had accepted it the moment he stepped inside. And as the road carried him away from Raven's Hollow, winding through stretches of pine and rock that should have felt like freedom, he understood with cold certainty that he would never truly leave. The lake was not a place anymore. It was a presence tethered to him, whispering in silence, dripping in darkness. It would wait in the corners of his dreams, in the pauses of conversation, in every lonely night when he thought the house around him was safe. It would shadow every dawn he woke to, every glance he cast towards still water, reminding him of depths he could never unsee. And when his time came, when his body failed him and his breath slowed to its last, he knew the weight would not lift, but only deepen, pulling him finally where all the others had gone. The lake would follow him, whispering in silence, dripping in darkness, a weight he would bear until his last breath.